we're going to build our very own trivia game, okay? And in the process, we're going to learn how to request and get some data from the internet. Let's face it, if your app doesn't have any type of internet communication or internet connectivity, it's going to be quite a boring app. So once your app is able to get information from the internet, you're able to expand the amount of data you have access to, and also you're able to get some data in real time. So in our example, we're going to be using a specific website as the back end of our trivia game. Okay. So we're going to get all the questions and answers for our trivia game from a website. So in Android, before we do anything that has to do with internet access, we first need to declare in our app manifest file that this app is going to be using internet. So when you go into the manifest folder, you'll see a file called Android manifest. And this is where we specify rules for our application, the different various activities, and so forth. Okay. And for security reasons, on Android, when you're using certain features such as the user's camera, the user's location, internet access, access to specific folders on the user's device, you need to specify that your app needs access to that specific thing. In our case, we need to specify that we're going to be using the internet. Otherwise, our app will run into errors whenever we try to do anything that has to do with the internet. This is the only line we need to add to our manifest file. It just uses permission, and then the permission is internet. So once we've done this, we've enabled our app to have internet connectivity. There are several different ways we can communicate with the internet with our Android app. There are several different libraries we can use. The two most common ones are the HTTP request library and the Volley library. The one I find that is the most reliable and the most efficient is the Volley library. Okay. So the Volley library is actually not built into Android, or it's not there by default, I should say. So we need to specify it in our dependencies. Second and last requirements that we need is to modify this build.gradle file. And there are two different files here that have the same name, but make sure that you're using the one from the module app. So the second build.gradle file over here. And this contains information about the app settings such as the target SDK, the app version, the application ID, and so forth. But the only part that we are going to modify here is the dependencies. We're going to add one more dependency here, and this is going to be the Android Volley library. So I'm just going to add implementation, and what we want to implement is Volley. So as you can see here, this one right here, this version number 1.0.0 is an outdated version. You can see that there's a newer version available. So I'm just going to click change to 1.2.1. So depending on when you see this, there might be a more recent version. Okay, so now that I've added that dependency to my build.gradle file, we are ready to start. So whenever you add any type of library or you make any changes to your Gradle file, make sure that you sync the changes. Otherwise, for instance, I just added this Volley library here. If I try to access it in my code, I won't be able to do that until I sync this. So I'm just going to click sync now, and now I'm good to go. So if I go into my main activity, If I do volley, as you can see, now I can have access to that volley library that we just added. So we're going to create a request queue. I'll go into much more detail as to what my code is supposed to do. But first, I'm going to write the code and explain later. Okay, so I just added 2 lines of code here. So the first one is the request queue. So any type of web request we send is going to have to go through this queue over here. So we can have several different requests, but in order for the request to be sent, we need to add it to the queue. So for instance, I'm going to call my request queue and then dot add, and this is the request that I just created. I'm going to add the string request. So now let's talk about the request. So there are different types of requests we can create. Can create a JSON request, a string request, request for an image, request for a page that uses JSON API, and so much more. But in this case, I'm just going to try to get a result that is in a string format. So I'm using my string request over here. So I've created a string request. The type of request method is a get method. So if you're familiar with HTTP request types, you'll know that a get request is essentially used for getting information from a website. There are different types of requests we can make as well. We can make post requests, delete requests, and so forth. But for the sake of this example, we're going to use a get request. And the website we're trying to access or get information from is, in this case, example.com. And then the response that we get from the website will be stored in this variable. And we can process the request in these brackets over here. And same with the error response. When we get an error response, we would take action on that error response in these brackets here. So let me just realign this to make this a little bit more user-friendly and easier to read. Okay, so hopefully now this is a little bit easier to read. All I did was modify this to a variable. So the URL I'll specify here, and then the response that I receive from the URL will be in this response variable right here. So I can do whatever I want with this variable. Maybe I might just want to display the value of this variable on my text view. And same with my error. If there's an issue with accessing this URL, the error message will be stored in this error variable here. And I can probably display the error message in this part of my code. The place I'm going to display these variables would be here. This text view that I have here, this default text view, instead of hello world, I'm going to make it whatever my response or error message is. And right now I've given it the ID of output text just so that it's easy to reference it inside my code. You know what, let me just remove this blueprint design here because I don't need it, so I'll just use the design view only. Okay, so my text view here is, or has the ID of output text. I'm going to use that here. So now I'm just going to display our response that we get on this text view over here. And if there is an error, I'll do the same. Okay, so I'll just display error and then I will display the error message. Okay, so let's give this a try. If all goes well, if I try to access google.com, the HTML code of this Google web page is going to be displayed here. So let me go ahead and run this. Okay, so it looks fine so far. Of course, this is not human readable. This is just the HTML code for google.com. But the purpose of this is to create a trivia game, okay? And in order to create that trivia game, we're going to use the data that we get from a website called opentbd.com, okay? So this is how to use this website. So I'm just going to go to the API section. For this trivia API, we have some custom selections that we can make. So for example, let's say I want 5 questions. I want the questions to be about computer science or computers. And the difficulty, I just want to make it easy for now. And the type of questions, I would make it multiple choice. And I'll just leave the last one as is. And now I can generate the API URL. So now all I need to do is copy this URL over here and then replace this google.com URL with that URL that I got. So now if I run my code, hopefully I should get something interesting in my app here from that website. So let me just make this a little bit bigger because it's very difficult and hard to see here. So I'm just going to stop this run and let's increase the text size. Let's make it 24. Okay, so now let me rerun this just to see if I can actually see the content. So as you can see here, I'm getting some information, and this information looks like it's in JSON format. So almost all the APIs that are available on the internet communicate using this file format over here. So let's try to decode this. So to do that, I'm just first going to copy this and I'm going to paste it in my browser. So as you can see, it generates random questions each time. So the results we got here is not exactly the same as what we see here. But let's try to decode this, okay? So I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to use a JSON parser. Basically, I'm going to search online for a website that can decode JSON text. Okay, so the one I'm using right now is jasonformatter.org. I just pasted that text in here. So this is the result I'm getting, okay? Let me maximize this so it's easier to see. So essentially, first, what I see is a response code, which is here. Let me just collapse this. So there's a response code and then there is the results, okay? So I have 5 different results or an array of 5 different items. And for each item, I have the category, which is computers, the type, which is the multiple choice that we selected, difficulty is easy, and then the question, in this case, is what does CPU stand for? And then the correct answer, which is central processing unit. And then since this is multiple choice, we are also provided with some incorrect answers that we can use. So it's the same for all the other questions, the same format. So let's say this third question over here, I have the category, the type, difficulty, question, and answer, and then the incorrect answers. So as you can see, all of this data is contained in this text. that we have here. So it's up to us in our mobile app to make use of this data that we have over here. So in order to do that, we need to use something else, okay? Instead of the string request that we have here, we're going to use a JSON object request, because the output that we're expecting from that website is a JSON, not just a simple string. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and modify this to make this a JSON object instead of a string request. Okay, so the only thing that I've changed here is the type, which is now the JSON object request. It used to be the string request, and I've changed the name of the variable to fit that type. And additionally, I just added one extra parameter here, which is required for a JSON object request, and it's null. Okay, so now this response that I get is no longer going to be a string. It's going to be a JSON object. So for now, I'm just going to comment this out, and let me show you how to get the data. Okay, so let me show you what I've done with this code over here. So in this line over here, what I'm essentially saying is I'm going to get from this object, JSON object that I've received, I'm getting the JSON array, which is called results. This is what I'm trying to get right now. And what I'm getting is the first item of the results array, which is index 0. As you can see here, this is the one that I'm trying to extract. So far, I've been able to get this section over here with this line of code over here. But what I'm trying to do now is get this specific question, and also I want to get the answer portion. So let's go ahead and try to do that. Okay, so what I've done so far here is for this JSON object that I've been able to extract, I am casting it as a JSON object. I'm letting Java know that this is a JSON object, and the string that I want to get from this JSON object is this one right here, which is the question. So since it's in a form of a string, I'm using getString, but I can use other things as well. So let's say if I click dot, you can see that there are different options for JSON objects. I can either get a string, I can get an array, and I can perform other operations. But in this case, what I want to do for this JSON object here is to get this string called question, or get the value of this string here that is question. So finally, after running this, I should be able to get this specific value over here. So let me just assign that to a string variable, and I'll call this question. So the reason why we're seeing a red underline here is because whenever we do anything to do with parsing or decoding a JSON, there's a chance that there might be an error. So we always have to put it in a try catch statement like this to handle the error. Keep in mind that I mentioned that I also want to get the answer for that question. So the only thing I need to modify here is this string. So I'm going to call this variable answer, and let's check what it was called again. It is called correct_answer. So So I'll do the same here. So now I'm just going to output both the question and the answer of the first trivia question. So let me just place that in here. And I'm just going to do this question. And then I will display the question variable. And then I'm just going to add a couple line breaks to divide the question and answer. And I will include the value of our answer variable. So if all goes well, I should see both the question and answer in my app. Let's go ahead and run this. Perfect. So now we've converted this JSON file format here that looks a little bit complicated to something that is useful or readable to our app user. So this question here is, what is the amount of bits commonly used, or what amount of bits commonly equals 1 byte? And in this case, it's 8. If I wanted to, I could also display the other potential answers for my multiple choice question. To do that, I will create another variable here. I'll just call this wrong answers. And I believe the format that I see here is incorrect answers. So let me just make this incorrect answers. And since this is an array, I will see an array of 3 different answers, or however many incorrect answers are in that multiple choice question. So what I'm going to do now is add that to the end of this string. Okay, so let me rerun this. There we go. So what the CPU stands for, Central Processing Unit, is a correct answer, and the other options for incorrect answers. So far our quiz app is, or our trivia app is coming together very well. But what we want to do here is basically give the user 2 options. We want it to be a true or false question so that the user can answer either true or false. So let's just go back to our Trivia API website here. Before we had 5, but in this case we'll make it 1 since we're just requesting for 1 question each time. And for the category, you know what, let's just leave this blank so all categories are involved. And then we'll make this easy, and then we'll make this true or false. So instead of giving the user multiple answers, it would be only 2. I'm going to generate the API URL one more time, and I'll simply paste it in here. So now if I run my code, as you can see, the question is not only related to computers anymore, and the answer can be either true or false. So since the answer is true or false, technically I don't even need this to extract this wrong answer data, since if it's not true then it's false, if it's not false then it's true. So I'm just going to remove this section, rerun my code, and everything should still run properly. So I want the user to be able to interact with this app, okay? So I'm going to add some buttons here that would say either true or false, and then I'm also going to add a scoreboard. So each time the user enters or answers correctly, they would get 1 extra point. If they answer incorrectly, a point will be removed. So first, let's design our user interface, and we're going to add 2 buttons. One will be for true and the other will be for false. Okay, so I'm just going to align them correctly. One interesting thing I can do is make these both center horizontally. So if I right click this after selecting both of them, I can click center horizontally. So now they are taking up equal space horizontally. And I also mentioned that there will be a scoreboard. So I'm just going to add this text view over here. I'll align that as well. Let's make the size a little bit bigger so it's more visible. Okay, so the default text here was going to be score 0 because the user is going to start at 0. And I'll just make this text view score as the name. And for the button, I'm going to update this to make this button true. And I would change the text on the button so that it says true. And I'll do something similar for false as well. Okay, so now I think our design view is complete. It should be enough. I'm going to link those design items to my code. Okay, so essentially what I've done here is link the items to my code. So now I can add some click listeners to my buttons. Okay, so if I click true, whatever is in this block will be executed. If I click false, this will be executed. So let's think about what we want to happen if the user clicks true. So the answer that we're going to receive, let's just see how it's going to look. So I'm just going to open this in my web browser. So this is the type of response we're going to receive. Essentially, the answer is going to be either true or false, the correct answer. If the user clicks true, I'm going to check if the value of this correct answer is matching what the user clicked, or is matching true. If it is, then I increase the score. If not, then I decrease the score. So I'm going to do that here. Okay, so we're seeing these two red highlights because we don't have a score variable yet, and also because this answer variable is not in this scope, so we can't access this answer variable from here. So I'm just going to move these two variables outside of this quest object here. I'm going to put it in the global scope so that any function in my activity will be able to access it. So really, the only one I really need to move will probably be the answer, but just to keep things consistent, I would move both of them. And the score is going to be an integer. Okay, so now this should be fine. So if the answer is true, then increase the score. But we also want to be able to decrease the score if it's not true. So I'll just put else score minus minus. And then finally, I'm going to update the score display. So this score text right here needs to be updated. There we go. So I can do the exact same thing for when the false button is clicked, but I'll just do the opposite. So I'll be checking for false instead of true. So I'm going to rerun our code. Okay, perfect. So the score starts at 0, and the question is, an isosceles triangle has two sides of equal length opposed to 3. And I am displaying the answer here, which I shouldn't. But we know that the answer here is true. So if I click true, as you can see, the score increases to 1. And I should get a new question after I click a button. So let's address both issues. One is that I shouldn't display the answer, otherwise it defeats the purpose of this trivia. And the second one is that each time a button is clicked, a new answer should be, or a new question should be displayed. So to do that, first I'm just going to remove this answer display from here. There are two ways to generate a new request. Either I can put this whole entire thing into a function and then call the function each time I click a button, or quite simply I can just call this right here. So I'm just going to add the same request to the queue again, our request queue, each time I click a button. So essentially, by adding the request to the request queue, I am basically requesting for a new random question. Okay, so let's rerun this and see. So one thing I want to modify here is to remove these HTML escape or HTML characters from here. So in HTML, this basically means quotes. And this, I believe, is an apostrophe. But instead of displaying the HTML version, I want to display it in a human readable plain text. So there is actually a method that I can use that will convert any HTML to readable text. Essentially, this line of code right here will convert any of these characters to the appropriate characters, and then I'm assigning it back to the question variable. So this should resolve this issue. And also, there's no need to display this question string, so I'm just going to remove this from here. So it will just show the question instead of saying question, colon, and then the question. So let's rerun this. So the question here is, actor Tommy Chong served prison time, true or false? I have no idea, but let's see if it's true. Oh, it looks like it's true. So as you can see, when I click a button, a new question gets displayed. And the quotes are now being displayed properly instead of using those HTML characters. I'm going to assume that is true. I guess it was false. So my score went down to 0. Anyways, you get the point of the game. So the main objective here was to show you how to have your app communicate with the internet. So let's just go over some of the main points that we covered. So in order to make your app communicate with the internet, first we need to specify that the app is going to be accessing the internet inside our manifest file. And then we're going to implement our Volley library. In this case, we're using Volley. We could use other types of libraries for internet communication, but I recommend Volley because it's probably the most reliable and the most efficient. And then in our code, depending on the type of request we're going to be making, we can create a request object. In this case, we're using a JSON file, or our website that we're accessing here was returning a JSON file. So we're using a JSON object request, and we're performing some operations on that response so that we can extract the specific value that we're looking for. In this case, it was question and answer. And if there was any type of error, we should be able to handle it here in this portion of our code. Speaking of error, you know what? Let me just try to show you what it might look like. So suppose I have an incorrect URL. I don't think this URL exists. let's just check to see. As you can see, our output text is displaying what our error message is. So here it says unknown host exception. Basically, it means it cannot find this URL. So the main two parts of our request object is the response and the error section. And then once we have our request objects created, we can always add it to our request queue. So each time we add a request to our queue processes the request. So that means that we can have just one queue in our code and we can have several different requests. In this case, we have one request, which each time a button is clicked, we are adding that request to our queue.